Have you ever written a really tricky email? You know, when you have to say something the other person doesn't want to hear or ask something the other person doesn't want to give? Emails like that, you have to be super delicate, humble, but yet clear, professional, but still personable. Well, Paul knows exactly how you feel. He's going to begin his appeal to Philemon for his runaway slave Onesimus in verse 8. Starting here in this box, let's take a look at this box in which Paul says, "Though I am bold enough to command you, I prefer to appeal." Now let's break this down. What is Paul so bold to command? Well, all that he says is that he's bold enough to command Philemon to do what is required. That's it. He is super ambiguous, and I think intentionally so. This is verse 8, but it's not until way down here in verse 17 where he's actually going to tell Philemon what he's asking. Paul has a lot of delicate email writing to do before he gets to that. For starters, Paul is going to allude to his authority, but without leaning on that authority. Now, he said that he was bold, right? He's bold enough to command. Why is he bold? Well, Paul is an apostle, right? But he's not going to say that. In in 9 of Paul's 13 letters in the New Testament, he opens those letters by saying, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. But he doesn't say that in the letter to Philemon. Take a look at how he opens this letter. He doesn't lean on his apostolic authority. Instead, he says, Paul, a prisoner for Jesus Christ. And it is as a prisoner that he appeals to Philemon. See this? I prefer to appeal to you, who? Paul, an old man and now a prisoner for Jesus Christ, appeal to you. I mean, there's a humility in that, isn't there? And it's that same humility that Paul is going to call Philemon to. He's going to, in the same way then, that Paul is not ashamed of his chains, so he's going to call Philemon to sacrifice his self-interests and his rights as a slaveholder. But more on that later. Furthermore, as an apostle, he would issue commands, right? I mean, read the book of Galatians. But as a fellow worker, Paul is going to appeal because he wants, the obedience to this command, whatever it is, to be completely Philemon's choice. Take a look at that in the text. I've highlighted it kind of in these gray colors, where he says, I'm bold enough to command, but I prefer you to appeal because I don't want to do anything without your consent, that your goodness may not be by compulsion. I don't want you to be compelled to do this good. And again, what is this good? Well, we're not told. We have to wait a little bit longer. But he is going to say here in verse 10 that Paul is appealing for Onesimus. And then he's going to kind of recall Onesimus's salvation, his conversion, which is great. But then comes this crucial moment where Paul will speculate on the sovereignty of God. It's kind of fun, where he says, perhaps this is why Onesimus was parted from you for a little while, that you may have him back forever. Now that Onesimus is saved and a child of the faith. So clearly, God is using Onesimus's sin to bring him to himself. But then comes this bombshell moment here. Let's take a look at it. This is like the moment in the whole letter. Down in verse 15, 16. Maybe he was parted for you for a little while, that you could have him back forever. Look at this, verse 16. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother. As a beloved brother. That's what Philemon was called. He's called beloved. Now Paul is going to say, hey, Onesimus, he is now your beloved brother. Should you really think of him as your slave? He doesn't say that, but there is more than a subtle hint happening there. And we see this especially in the conclusion of what as well, where Paul says, I write to you confident of your obedience, hint, hint, um, but even that you would do even more. What could that be except releasing Onesimus, setting him free, no longer as a slave? But let's take an opportunity to talk for a couple minutes about the nature of slavery in the first century, because it's very different than the slavery that I think about, American slavery, or perhaps the slavery that maybe comes to your mind. So, slavery in the Roman Empire. Here's a crazy statistic for you. A full third of the entire population of the Roman Empire were slaves. 1 in 3. And you would find these slaves at every level of society. They weren't just working on plantations. Slaves could be doctors, teachers. Slaves would run businesses. You would find them employed in government positions. They were completely interwoven into um, the fabric of society. Therefore, it was unthinkable that you could snap your fingers or wave your wand and make the institution of slavery just disappear. It wasn't possible at the time. And also, you couldn't tell a difference between a slave and his master. Slaves weren't only of a certain color of skin. Slavery was not an ethnic thing in the first century, because you became a slave most often through poverty. You had to sell yourself into slavery, or perhaps you were born into slavery, or maybe you were defeated in battle against Rome and you were enslaved for a time. And I say for a time because slavery was not a permanent condition in that time. Slaves were very frequently set free, or the word is manumission, for being released. And it was, like I said, very common. Most slaves were actually set free at the age of 30, that they would be released on their 30th birthday. Or if they could earn enough money before that, they could buy their uh, freedom. However, despite all of this, you didn't want to be a slave. Slaves were still the lowest rung on the social ladder. But let's get back to the letter, all right? Back to Philemon. This material I've kind of lumped together in verses 8 to 16, and there's an overlap, I realize, but I just kind of arranged things categorically. So we're going to look at verses 12 to 20 now as we transition to this other half. So Paul would be glad to keep Onesimus, but he knows he has to send him back to Philemon. Now he asks Philemon to receive him. Let's take a look at this little progression in the text. I highlighted it with these colors, with the color purple, where Paul is going to say, hey, I would love to keep Onesimus with me here in Rome, but you know what? I'm sending him back to you. I'm asking you now, Philemon, to receive him. Here you go. So let's again break down this box here. Paul says that he'd love to keep Onesimus because Onesimus is so useful to him in his imprisonment. And here he's playing with the name of Onesimus's name, with the meaning of his name. Onesimus means useful, but Paul says he was useless to you before, but now he's useful to both of us. However, he says, I'm sending him back, and in so doing, I am sending my very heart, Paul says. Very affectionate language, but I think that he's linking this to the request that he has for Philemon, because back in his Thanksgiving, Paul says, I thank God for your love, Philemon, and that you have refreshed the hearts of the saints. He's sending his heart. You refresh the hearts of the saints. And then the very last verse in this section, verse 20, Paul says, now I ask you to refresh my heart. So we're kind of subtly preparing Philemon yet again for this request. Onesimus is in my heart, Paul says. He should be in your heart as well. Now, how is Philemon going to refresh Paul's heart? Well, here's the moment again, the request. Verse 17, Paul says, I would have you receive Onesimus as you would receive me. Now, how did the father receive his prodigal son? in, I believe it's Luke 15, a son who basically stole from him, right, and then ran away. A very similar story. Um, well, that is the same way that Paul would have Philemon receive Onesimus. I mean, it is a big ask, no doubt about it, but really, it's a story of reconciliation, and that's what the whole letter of Philemon is about. That is God's cosmic goal for all of creation, right? Reconciling things to himself. Now, do you remember the two letters that the letter of Philemon was sent with, given to Tychicus and then carried to Asia? Well, it's Ephesians and Colossians. Now, Colossae, the church in Colossae, that's Philemon's home church. So the content in Colossians is going to be read in Philemon's hearing. Philemon is probably an elder in that church. And look at some of the things that Paul says in his letter to Colossians about reconciliation. Let's jump over to the letter of Colossians for a minute. Colossians chapter 1. Let's look at verses 19 and 20. All the fullness of God dwells in Jesus, and through Jesus, God the Father is reconciling all things and all people to himself. And how's he doing it? By making peace through the blood of his cross. So all people who have been reconciled to him, um, there is no distinction between them, between those who are reconciled and now united to Christ. Let me show you that down in verse 3, or in chapter 3, where those who are being renewed after the image of their Creator, he says, among those people, there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, slave or free. Why? Because both slave and master are in Christ, and Jesus is in all, and he is all. Now, that doesn't mean that slavery is abolished. He's still going to have some, injunctions for these classes, but what it does mean is that people like Onesimus, former slaves, they should be considered beloved brothers. Remember, Philemon, he is a beloved fellow worker. Paul calls Philemon to receive Onesimus back, no longer as a slave, but as a beloved brother who is one of you. I mean, isn't that powerful? Isn't that beautiful? But look how Paul introduces this request. He says, if we have koinonia, these little V's, it's the letter nu, and it's pronounced with an N. This is omega, pronounced with the O sound, koinonia. If we have koinonia, receive him as you would receive me. Let's see that. Let's go back to Philemon. Scroll down. He says, all right, if you consider me your partner. Now, this is the adjective adjective version of the noun koinonia. This is koinonas. If I am a partner, if I have koinonia with you, then receive him as you would receive me. And this is a critical word for the letter of Philemon. And it's used one more time in verse 6 in the Paul's prayer, his opening prayer, where he says, I pray that the sharing of your faith, the koinonia of your faith may become effective for the full knowledge of every good. And basically what Paul is praying for here in verse 6 is that God would do such a work in Philemon's heart that supernatural forgiveness would be possible. Let's walk through that prayer, because I think it is, again, critical for the letter. So what is Paul praying? He prays that the koinonia of Philemon's faith would become effective so that he both understands and puts into practice all the good things that are at work in us as those who have been united to Christ. Jesus is reconciling all things to himself, and he's doing good works through the church, who is now his body. So let's talk about this word koinonia. What does it mean? What's going on here? Well, Philemon, he has koinonia with Paul in the gospel. It's a partnership. It's a joining kind of word. So Philemon is going to share in the gospel. He is going to have fellowship together with those who have been changed by the gospel. He is a mutual participant in the gospel. He is a partner in that gospel. And when that partnership, when that koinonia becomes effective in Philemon's heart, then he will become a conduit of the good that Jesus is working through his church, which is the reconciling of all things and all peoples. Now, what is Paul's role in this partnership, right? So Philemon, he's a koinonos, he's a partner in the gospel. I mean, he's a partner with Paul. What is Paul's role? Well, he knows his role very well. Let's look at verse 18, in which he spells out what his role in this relationship is. Paul is going to say, hey, if Onesimus has wronged you at all, if Onesimus owes you anything, charge that to my account. And look how serious he is. He says, I, Paul, write this with my own hand. I will repay, Paul says. And you know what's funny about the book of Philemon? The death of Jesus is not mentioned once. It is the only letter of Paul in which he never mentions the story of the gospel and the cross. Now, Paul doesn't have to teach the message of the cross in this letter because Paul is acting that out here in the letter. Paul is putting himself in the place of Jesus. He is absorbing the consequences of Onesimus's wrong, and he's paying Onesimus's debt in order that Onesimus may be reconciled to Philemon. It's just what Jesus did for us, paying our debts that we can be reconciled to the Father. And that is how Paul is acting out his role as a minister of reconciliation between Philemon and Onesimus. I mean, it's really powerful stuff. So why is a letter like this in our Bibles? Well, it teaches us that the gospel is not just abstract theology, but it is real life transformation and healing put on display. And really, this is just one of countless gospel stories told and retold a million times throughout history and today as well in your life, if you allow the koinonia of your faith to become effective so that God can work in